this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader, reading books for you. Today, I will be reading chapters 19 and 20 from Two Very Rare Bears by S.B. Bullock and G.S. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to the authors for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I've included links for me to find and purchase this book. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 19. By now, all of the children, Grandma, Grandpa, and Maggie were at the top of the escalators as they watched little George disappear down to the next floor. "It can't be," said Harry. "We've come this far. It can't end like this." Little James was crying. So was Emily. Harry was in shock. Eva turned to Tom and said, "We need a miracle. We can't let George leave here with that horrendous family." Little did they know that a miracle was just around the corner. For who should just walk out of the hi-fi department on the floor below? None other than their new friend, Sam Scotford from the train. "It's Mega Mix 2!" cried James. "Sam! Sam!" shouted Eva. Everyone was waving and shouting down the escalator at Sam. But due to the fact his mother had just treated him to some brand new, top-of-the-range, noise-canceling headphones, Sam couldn't hear a thing. Sam's mum, Gil, was walking a little ahead and had missed the commotion as she was on the phone to her husband, Russell, talking about buying a new TV. Sam then put his head down, staring at his music player, which never seemed to leave his hand. Ray, Stacy, and Chelsea turned around to look back at Tom and his family as they were calling Sam so loudly. Chelsea stuck out her tongue and pulled a mean face while blowing raspberries at the children. As they hit the bottom of the escalator, so did Sam, oblivious to them or anything around him. He walked straight across their path. Ray was first to step off the escalator and tripped straight over Sam's foot. Stacy immediately fell on top of Ray, and then Chelsea went flying over her piled-up parents, letting go of everything she was carrying, including George, who did a 360-degree spin in the air and landed on the upwards escalator heading back up to the toy department. Tom and family couldn't believe what was happening. Mega Mix 2 was by now off on his way, completely unaware of the chaos he had just caused. And little George was now sat up on the escalator, heading back towards his brother Harry and the family. Eva knelt down on the top of the escalator with her arms stretched out. "Come on, George, come on!" she shouted. The family all joined in, cheering him on. "Come on, George!" they shouted. George couldn't understand a word of English, but he knew what they meant. The escalator seemed to take an eternity to get to the top. George was seconds away from being reunited with Harry. But all of a sudden, the escalator ground to a halt. Ray had scrambled to his feet and pressed the emergency stop button. "Oi!" he shouted. "That's our bear!" "No, it's not!" shouted Eva. He's our bear!" Just then, Emily sprang into action. She squeezed past Eva and ran down the escalator, scooping up George, and as quick as lightning, back up the steps towards her family. By now, the Morgans were all back on their feet. "Go and get my doggy bear back, Daddy!" screamed Chelsea. And with that, all three of them started running up the escalator. Emily held George tightly as she followed the others, who were walking as fast as they could, whilst pushing Tom in his wheelchair. They weaved through the busy Christmas shoppers. As Grandpa looked over his shoulder, he saw Ray pushing past customers, shouting, "Out of my way! Move!" The children suddenly found themselves back at the scene of the wreckage Ray had caused 5 minutes earlier, where he destroyed the Christmas display. Winifred was stood there with the Churchill security team trying to figure out who had ruined Churchill's prized Christmas tree. "I don't know what happened," said Winifred. "It all happened so quickly," she said to the burly security team. Tom stopped his wheelchair at the side of Winifred, tapped her on the leg, and said, "Excuse me, miss, are you looking for the man that did this?" "Yes, we are," cried Winifred. Tom turned around and pointed to the approaching Ray and said, "That's who did it. He's the one who ruined your display." Winifred looked at Tom. "Right," she said, while turning to the security team. "Get 'em, boys." The security men stepped into Ray's path, and he was stopped in his tracks. "Going somewhere, sir?" they said. "Yeah, I want my daughter's doggy bear," scowled Ray. "I don't think so, sir. You're coming with us. We have reason to believe you are responsible for destroying Churchill's Christmas display," said one of the security guards. Stacy and Chelsea were now stood behind Ray. "Leave my husband alone. It's them kids you need to be chasing. They've taken my Chelsea's bear," said Stacy. "Do you know who I am?" said Ray. "I'm Ray Morgan." "We don't care if you're the Queen of Sheba. You're coming with us," said another security guard. And with that, they escorted the Morgans off the premises into the arms of the police, who had just arrived, with Chelsea wailing, "I want my bear!" whilst sticking her tongue out at the crowds of startled shoppers. "Dreadful man," said Winifred. As she glanced down, she saw George in Emily's hand. "Is this the little doggy bear that has caused all the problems?" she said. Emily looked at Winifred meekly and said, "Yes, miss, we were hoping to buy him for my brother Tom." Winifred looked at Tom and said, "Due to all the commotion here tonight, and with your help in finding the culprit responsible for destroying my Christmas display, I think Churchill's would be more than happy to make a gift of this small bear to you and your family." "Oh, thank you so much," said all of the children. "Thank you ever so much, Miss Draycott," said Grandpa, as he glanced at her name badge. "I told you it was the most wonderful store in the world," said Auntie Maggie. Tom looked down at Harry, who was still hidden on his lap behind Emily's back. He was grinning like a Cheshire cat. "What a day," said Grandma. "I think we all need a nice cup of tea." "I don't know about tea," said Auntie Maggie. "We all need to celebrate and I'm starving. It's almost 8 o'clock at night. I think we should all go to my favorite restaurant as we're near Chinatown, the Golden Trout, known to regulars as the Golden Trowel. Why's that? Said Eva. Because they trowel the food on lovely, generous portions, a real belly filler. The owner, Mr. Young, is a very good friend of mine. It's fabulous. Everyone laughed and agreed. They all got into the elevator, and once the doors were firmly closed, the moment Harry had longed for had arrived. Harry, here's your brother, said Emily, gently placing George into Tom's lap, next to Harry. The little bears stared at each other and then embraced, rubbing their snouts together. Everybody had a lump in their throats as they witnessed the touching scene. Then they all started applauding and cheering. They had done it. They exited the elevator, made their way out of Churchill's, and headed on foot to Chinatown. At last, Harry and George were reunited. Chapter 20. They arrived at the Golden Trowel 10 minutes later. Mr. Young embraced Maggie excitedly. "Ah, Merry Christmas, Margaret! This must be your lovely family," he said. "Merry Christmas to you too, Mr. Young," said Maggie, kissing him on both cheeks, European style. "This is my mother, Christine." Grandma said, "Hello," and smiled at Mr. Young. "My father, David." Grandpa shook Mr. Young's hand. "And these are my nieces and nephews, Eva, Emily, Tom, and last but not least, James." All four children smiled and in turn greeted Mr. Young. "Come on in. I have a large table free at the back. Perfect for you," said Mr. Young. Everyone made their way to the back of the restaurant. Tom was last in, with Eva pushing him. "Ah, very cute," said Mr. Young, pointing at Harry and George, not realizing the little bears could actually hear him. "I hope they are hungry," he said, laughing. At the back of the restaurant, through an archway decorated with pictures of golden temples and photographs of Mr. Young, with an array of happy customers, there was a large table away from the hustle and bustle of the other diners. On the wall was a television showing the evening news, as Mr. Young liked to know what was going on in the world. The children were fascinated by the multicolored lanterns that hung from the ceiling above their heads, and the huge koi carp which swam around in a big glass tank. Mr. Young disappeared to fetch some menus. Now, in the privacy of the back of the restaurant, Harry and George climbed from Tom's lap and onto a spare chair. "Is it okay for us to sit here?" Harry said to Tom. "Yes, just be still when Mr. Young comes back over," said Tom. "Is George okay?" said Eva. "He's very quiet." "Well, George doesn't speak English," said Harry. "He only speaks Mandarin. Sorry, I forgot to tell you." "Wow," said Tom. "I didn't know that." Just then, Mr. Young arrived back with a handful of menus and complimentary prawn crackers. Maggie looked at George and then said, "I think we'll let a certain member of our party do the ordering for us, Mr. Young." "Oh," said Mr. Young. "Is one of the children learning Mandarin?" "Not exactly," said Maggie, Mr. Young, I've known you for over 20 years. You've seen me through some difficult times, and you've always helped me, so I know I can trust you." Mr. Young looked puzzled. "You're not going to propose marriage to me, are you, Maggie?" Everyone started laughing. "Oh, no, Mr. Young, nothing like that," said Maggie, now blushing. "Mr. Young, I would like you to meet George," said Maggie, gesturing towards the bears. "The world's only, as far as we know it, Mandarin-speaking Doggy Bear and his brother Harry." Mr. Young erupted in laughter. "Margaret, you are a very funny lady," he said, humoring Maggie. He leaned over to the bears and said in Mandarin, "Which one of you is George then?" Still laughing. But his laughter soon turned to shock as George stood up and answered in perfect Mandarin, "Hello, Mr. Young. Very pleased to meet you. It's such a relief to talk to someone. I've been stuck up a Christmas tree for the last few days," he replied. Mr. Young's mouth fell wide open. "Could you please thank this lovely family for helping Harry come and rescue me?" said George. Mr. Young, still open-mouthed, said to the rest of the table, "George says thank you to you all for rescuing him." "Don't be alarmed, Mr. Young. Harry, introduce yourself too," said Tom. Harry did the same. Okay. I am dreaming," said Mr. Young. The children started laughing. "It's true, Mr. Young," said Emily. "You're not dreaming. They are alive. We've just rescued George from being stuck up the Christmas tree in Churchill's." "This just gets crazier. I need to sit down," said Mr. Young. Across the table, Mr. Young, still in shock, sat down staring at the two little bears. "I can't believe what I'm seeing. I feel dizzy," he said. George opened the menu and proceeded to read out the dishes available in perfect Mandarin. Mr. Young could not believe what he was seeing and hearing. It was a long list. The children looked bewildered. "I'm very hungry," said James. "No need to order. I'll ask the kitchen to bring a Mr. Young special selection. My treat. Now tell me everything," said Mr. Young. With that, he disappeared into the kitchen, was back in a flash, and everyone proceeded to tell him the whole story, stopping only when the waiter came through with more dishes. "Wow!" Mr. Young couldn't believe his ears. "Your auntie always surprises me, but this time I'm lost for words. What an incredible story! What are you going to do now?" Just then, James tapped Grandma and pointed to the TV screen on the wall, which had the volume turned down. "There's Churchill's," said James. The news slide on the bottom of the TV screen read, "Christmas mayhem at Churchill's." Mr. Young reached over and grabbed the television remote. He turned up the volume just in time to hear the newsreader say, "And now going live to our reporter, Marie Chapelot, who is at Churchill's toy department in central London." They saw Winifred Draycott and the disheveled Christmas tree, and then the CCTV footage of Ray Morgan wrecking the Christmas display. The police have identified the culprit as Ray Morgan, one of the biggest ever Euro Millions jackpot winners, said Marie. The police are baffled as to why he would do such a thing. The Morgan family have had a lifetime ban, said Winifred. So, a real-life Grinch? said Marie. Absolutely. I urge any respectable establishment in London to do the same. A brute of a man, he was shaking the tree so violently that he smashed hundreds of our limited edition Union Jack baubles. Marie held up one of the baubles to the camera for the viewers to see. Thank you, Miss Draycott. Definitely a man without Christmas spirit. This is Marie Chapelot reporting for London News. Back to you, Alistair, in the studio. Mr. Young muted the volume. What an awful man! You are very lucky you did not end up with this horrible family, George, he said in Mandarin. I think you must all be very tired. I can use the staff minibus to take you all home. There is room for a wheelchair, Thomas. Don't worry. So, with full bellies and a day they would never forget, the children, Grandma, Grandpa, Auntie Maggie, Harry and George, all headed back to Hampstead for a good night's sleep. As Mr. Young's staff van pulled up outside Maggie's house, Mr. Young turned to Harry and George and said, Don't worry, my little friends. Your secret is safe with me. Thank you for giving me the most unforgettable night of my life. We will keep in touch. Goodbye and good luck. Mr. Young said goodbye to the rest of the family and wished them all a Merry Christmas. They thanked him for his hospitality, and then he trotted off into the night. He's such a nice man, said Maggie, as she unlocked her front door to be greeted by her cats. Come in, everybody. Mind the cats, she said. Bedtime, children, said Grandma. It's been a long day. It certainly has, said Tom. Tom and James, you're in the ground floor bedroom. Everybody else upstairs. Harry and George can sleep with me, said Tom. All 7 cats usually followed Maggie around the house, but tonight they followed Harry and George into Tom's front room. The cats then circled around the bears, just like the alpacas did back at the farm. Harry and George stroked each cat, and just like the alpacas had back on Pendle Farm, they all lay down. That's amazing, said Tom. Harry and George can communicate with animals. I thought it was a fluke back on the farm, but it's not. Then they all got ready for bed and quickly fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Tom and James were awoken by the sound of laughter, but not normal laughter. It was coming from the mouths of Harry and George, who were in hysterics. Tom rolled over on his bed and saw the bears riding around on the backs of Queenie, the white Turkish, Angora, and Pippin, the Siamese. James jumped out of his bed and started playing with them, all of them on the floor. Harry and George are coming home to Pendle Farm with us, aren't they, Tom? Said James. Of course. Well, if they want to, that is, said Tom, directing it towards Harry. Well, we do like London, but I think I can speak for George, even though he doesn't speak English. We'd be honored to come and live with you and the family at Pendle Farm. Fantastic! I was hoping you'd say that, said Tom. Just then, the bedroom door opened and Auntie Maggie said, Morning, boys. Oh my, look at the cats with Harry and George. The cats love them. And we love the cats, said Harry. They are beautiful. Maggie usually ate breakfast alone, but this morning was different. For sat Around her large breakfast table were 4 children, 2 grandparents, 7 cats, and 2 talking doggy bears. As they all tucked into their porridge, Grandma turned to Maggie and said, "Maggie, Grandpa and I have been talking. We'd love you to come up to Pendle Farm with us, all for Christmas." All the children looked at Auntie Maggie, smiling. "I'd absolutely love to," replied Maggie. "I just have to check if my neighbors Wendy and Brian can look after the cats while I'm away." "Of course," said Grandma. Just then, from across the table, Emily said, "I wish we could get some cats, Grandma." "Me too," said Eva. "And me," said James. "I love Pippin." "What about you, Tom?" said Grandpa. "Oh, yes, I'd love a cat, especially one like Queenie." "Okay," said Grandpa. "We'll look at getting some rescue cats in the new year." Maggie turned to her father and said, "Dad, I've got a great idea. Why don't you take Queenie and Pippin? They'll make a great Christmas gift, and we could all travel up to Pendle Farm together." The children erupted with cries of, "Yes, Grandpa! Yes, Grandpa! Yes, Grandpa!" "Okay," said Grandpa. "That's a great idea. Welcome to the family, Queenie and Pippin." "That's wonderful," said Maggie. "Right, I'd better book my train ticket. I'll just check with Wendy and Brian next door. Steph, Alex, and Olivia, their 3 daughters, are so good with the cats." 10 minutes later, after a chat with the neighbors, she returned, all sorted. Maggie said, "It's fine, they're happy to do it. Let's book my ticket. I'll bring them something back from Yorkshire." Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for chapters 21 and 22. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book.